Okay, so now we're going to talk kind of about, again, epidemiological potpourri here. So first, Koch's postulates. There's a lovely picture in the notes. So basically there are two types of Koch's postulates. One, like classic Koch's postulates, try to establish the link between the pathogen and the infection. So how do you do that? First, you need to show that the pathogen, I'm going to use Zika virus as the example. First, you need to show that the pathogen is present in sick people, but not in healthy people. Okay? So you look at pregnant women who have Zika virus infection versus those who didn't, okay? And you see that in women that had Zika virus infection, the percent of microcephalic births is higher. So you can see at least an association between the pathogen and the problem. That makes sense? Then you isolate that pathogen and grow it in a pure culture. Sometimes it's impossible, but you can do it with Zika virus. And then you use that Zika virus to infect lab animals. Here comes the problem. Sometimes lab animals do not develop the same symptoms as humans do. Michael Diamond from Washington University, they managed to develop a model. Okay, so they infect model animals. They show that in the model animals, they see the same symptoms, okay, as they see in humans. And they show that the virus is associated with those pathological changes. And they managed to isolate virus from those sick animals back. So those are 4 steps. Pathogen is in sick but not healthy. It can be grown in pure culture. It causes the same disease in the experimental model. It can be isolated from those infected experimental animals. All sounds hunky-dory, really, really hard to run it in the real life. This is why establishing the link takes so much time. Now, molecular Koch's postulates, they deal more with what are virulence factors. Does that make sense? So, for instance, you have, I'm going to use an example different from the notes. So you have 2 strains of Streptococcus, the smooth and the rough strain. The smooth strain is much more virulent. It causes, I don't know, pneumonia and meningitis, blah, blah, blah. So why is that so? You figure out that smooth strain has a capsule, while rough strain does not. Okay, does that make sense? So you say, okay, my suggestion is that the capsule is the culprit. So you find a set of genes responsible for making a capsule. Okay, you with me? You remove those genes. If virulence, bless you, decreases, then that was a culprit for that particular disease. Does that make sense? And then you take this virulence island of sorts, those genes, and put it back. It's all very easy manipulations. Put it back and you restore the virulence. So you can link not just the disease with a pathogen, but the disease with a certain genotype of a pathogen. This is what we call molecular Koch's postulates. Does that make sense? So basically when people say this genetic variant has a better fitness, I want to see how changing certain amino acids in certain proteins will affect the pathogenesis of this virus, at least in the model, which is really hard because for coronavirus there is no good, well, not really, no. There's some models that are better than others, but not really a good model. Okay, that makes sense so far? Now, a couple more sort of epidemiology features. So first, terms, let's talk about prevalence and incidence. So incidence number of cases per population per time. That's important. Time is involved. So if I tell you that the incidence is 5 cases per 1,000 people per day, does that make sense? It can be any period of time. Often, CDC reports incidence annually. So they say incidence of a certain disease is whatever number of cases per 100,000, it's a typical denominator, per year. Now what's the difference between incidence and prevalence? We take out time, bless you. Okay? Does that make sense? So let me just give an example. Let's say, I don't know the population of city of Manor, but let's say it's, I don't know, 50,000 people. Okay, I don't really know how much. 50,000 people. Okay? So I can say that in the city of Manor, per 50,000 people, incidence of coronavirus infections is 10 cases per day. Population is known, right? But the prevalence is 500 infections, which means 500 people out of 50,000 are currently infected. Does that make sense? Now, obviously, this prevalence, like the illustration that you have in the notes with the bathtub, it's really good illustration. When a person gets sick, there are 2 outcomes. They either recover or die. Does that make sense? So you have 2 drains for that bath. Deaths and recovery. That makes sense? And recovery, people who recover, they can, if they can get reinfected, they can get back in the pool. That's totally possible. Does that make sense? Or like some infections, they don't have the recovery drain, like HIV. The only drain is death, okay? So every year we have some people infected with HIV. So prevalence in population, well, population grows, so it kind of doesn't really increase, but if population doesn't grow and we have like explosive, prevalence will grow explosively. Does that make sense, the whole idea? Now, one of my least favorite terms, morbidity, which usually is used qualitatively, okay? So we can say this infection has high morbidity. That's Ebola. A lot of, like, coronavirus has high morbidity. A lot of people get really sick. Rhinovirus has low morbidity. People don't get really sick. Make sense? So the only quantitative way to define morbidity is number of disease per number of infections. Again, there's disease, there's disease. There's sniffles, and there's, hospital stay in ICU. Okay, so again, it's very, very imperfect way to quantify morbidity. Does that make sense to you? Now, my favorite one is mortality, which is formally defined. It's the number of deaths per number of cases. Okay? Now, sometimes you can see, sometimes you can see that it gets reported slightly differently. It may be reported like this, or number of deaths per 100,000 people, per population, right? Now, why this way is better than this? Check this out. If I tell you that a particular disease kills 2 people per 100,000, and another disease kills 200 people out of each 100,000, you would say, oh, that other disease, which is like 200,000 is much worse. Well, if every person, everybody gets infected, but only 200 out of 100,000 die, maybe we should do a better job at controlling the transmission, right? But if, in an example with 2 out of 100, if everybody who gets infected die, then by itself, the infection is much worse. Does that make sense? So like, the number of people who die from rabies every year in the United States is single digits. But almost every person who gets infected and doesn't get treatment, every person dies. Like, if you develop clinical symptoms, you might as well just shoot yourself. It's awful. It's an awful disease, terrible disease. You know, it's absolutely one of the worst ways to go. Does that make sense? So, this is why I prefer this. We can express it in percentage. Here's the problem. It almost can never be calculated. Because let's take coronavirus. Do we know all cases? Absolutely not. Rough estimates, we know from quarter to a half of all the cases. Okay? Do we know all the deaths? Surprisingly, no. The way to know the deaths is to look at excessive mortality. So look at how many people died in, say, 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. Are you following me? So for instance, if in November of 2020, 100,000 people died, and in November 2019, 50,000 people died, we have 50,000 extra, which can be attributed to the effects of coronavirus. Now we enter the really gray area of somebody was so afraid to go to the hospital, they died of stroke at home. Is that a COVID death? Go figure. Somebody was 4-stage cancer, had 2 months to live, ended up with COVID, died 1 month later. You know, those are kind of pet peeves, small pet peeves, but usually the number of deaths is undercounted. Number of cases is also undercounted. The question is, what's undercounted more? For COVID, if you're interested, I can tell you. For COVID, the most reliable numbers come from countries like Singapore. Well, no, Singapore we can toss. Singapore is weird. Iceland and New Zealand. Singapore has incredibly low mortality, just insanely low mortality. But if you look at Iceland and New Zealand, they report 0.5%. Now, the number that they report is slightly different from this. It will be number of reported deaths number of reported cases, which is referred to as CFR, case fatality ratio. Does that make sense?
What does that stand for?
Case fatality ratio. So if you will go on any statistical website and look for, COVID data for the United States, I don't have it open right now, but CFR for the US is roughly 2% and a change. Does that make sense? Which means 2% of people who got detectable, who were tested, died. And those deaths were attributed to COVID. See what I'm saying? In reality, usually actual mortality is lower than CFR. So for COVID, most likely it's in the ballpark of 0.5%. Again, it's an average mortality. My favorite story was look at the mortality among the age groups. It goes from 0.01% for children to 15% for 80 and over, which is terrifying. That makes sense so far. Now, in terms of geographical distribution, I have an illustration in the notes, so I'll just explain. So, difference between sporadic, endemic, epidemic, pandemic. Sporadic, here and there. Botulism in the United States is sporadic. Does that make sense? Rabies in the United States is sporadic. It can happen in Ohio, it can happen in Texas, it can happen in California. There is no geographical attribution. Am I clear? Endemic. Disease is common in a certain area. Okay? Rift Valley fever is endemic in Africa. Coccidioidomycosis is endemic in California. Histoplasmosis is endemic in Ohio. Does it make sense? Epidemic. Two kind of conflicting definitions, either a lot of disease, or I like more, and I think it's more correct, higher than normal. So, let's say, every year we expect flu. Make sense? We expect certain number of infections every year. If actual number in one particular year becomes much higher, are you following me? We call it an epidemic, a flu epidemic. We can expect a couple of cases of cryptosporidiasis here and there. There was an outbreak, epidemic outbreak of cryptosporidium in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There were like 200 plus cases. Is that a lot? Compared to one, that's a lot. Does that make sense? So epidemic doesn't have to be at the scale of a country. It can't be at the scale of a city, epidemic outbreak. Now, with coronavirus, we can see initially it was an epidemic in the Wuhan province, then it was an epidemic in Wuhan and adjacent provinces. And eventually, when it spread throughout the globe, it became pandemic. Does that make sense? Again, WHO has certain kind of number game. With SARS-1, it was never a pandemic because total number of cases was 8,000. It was just not enough. That make sense? We're good. So before we switch to quick conversation about trypanosoma, what I want to highlight, one of the kind of most comprehensive questions on that. So first of all, we're going to have a lot of questions like, which of the following is a direct transmission route? Or I give you a description, what kind of vector are we talking about here? One of the questions, I'm telling you up front, you will characterize a pathogen. For instance, coronavirus, okay, can be transmitted between people via respiratory route or can be acquired from bats. And it is now found all over the globe in huge numbers. What kind of disease is that? So you think, okay, directly transmitted, because it's respiratory between human, can be acquired from bats, zoonotic, with pandemic distribution, because it's all over the globe. And you pick that right description. Does that make sense? Usually, if you think through and you look at the answers, like really carefully, there's only one answer that makes sense. Okay? Especially on this exam, number 4, not 3, 4, that's already next one. I very much encourage to come to me and ask for explanations, because sometimes if I explain it a little bit more, a little bit wider, it immediately makes sense. Okay? Now,